Hey guys, so what is a girl to do over her vacation from her PhD program? Then read a lot of nonfiction. That is right, I have another supplementals episode for you today because I have read 5 more, and actually at this taping I have read 9 books you haven't seen. So I'm almost ready for another supplementals episode. That is how obnoxious my reading has been lately with nonfiction. I've just been blowing through it. I have a list here, and if you watch my Q4 wrap up, you've actually seen all 5 of these. This will be wrapping up all of the nonfiction that I read in 2021, like actually quite nicely, finishing off with my last nonfiction book of the year. And then the next supplemental episode that I do will roll over into everything that I read, or the first 5 books that I read in 2022. We are gonna hop like literally from the birth of the country to our most recent former president in this one. So it's gonna be a trip. But the first one that we're going to talk about is Countdown 1945, the extraordinary story of the atomic bomb and the 116 days that changed the world by Chris Wallace. That is a really, really long subtitle, and I don't like it. This book also just wasn't great. I picked it up because it was fairly short and I was in between other books that I was waiting for, and I knew that Chris Wallace, who was formerly of Fox and is now, I believe, going to be with NBC doing some online stuff. I could be wrong, but he's written quite a few books and he's a very respected journalist, so I thought, hey, I'll give it a try. This book is ostensibly, if you didn't guess from that subtitle, the 116-day countdown leading up to Harry S. Truman dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It does not just follow Truman. There are several different point of views that are all spun together in a really interesting mixed storyline. So someone living in Japan, someone working on the bomb, someone opposing the bomb, people who obviously are loyal to Truman, don't want to launch the bomb in his cabinet, and then Truman himself. So there are too many points of view in this story is actually one of its problems. There are too many points of view. It is too short, and some of the points of view don't seem to have a point. And it was so forgettable that I even forget what those points of view were. And I really wanted to like this because this book really reminded me at its idea of the King Richard, slow burn through Watergate book that I gave 5 stars. But this was just, it was too bumpy. The point of views didn't mesh together. We were all tracking towards the same moment, but it just didn't seem to have a real cohesion to it. And I don't think that I learned anything that I didn't already know. So if this is a book that you are interested in, or a topic that you're interested in, I'm sure there are many other books on the topic that are better. So switching to much more forward in time, I also listened to Trump on Trial, The Investigation, Impeachment, Acquittal, and Aftermath. This is the problem with libraries. So when I was reading about the book, it said now with new information covering the second impeachment, and I was like, oh, well, that would be really cool. But the version that I had only covered Trump's first impeachment, and honestly, that was fine with me. I definitely covered the second one more than I covered the first one. And in particular, the second one, it was about January 6th. There was a very clear inciting point, and I feel like the first one, the phone call, the aid, like if you weren't paying attention to all the moving pieces, it was kind of hard to follow exactly who and how and what all connected. If you did follow the first impeachment fairly closely, this book will not give you any new information. It is not an expose. It is not trying to make a point. What it is reporters from the Washington Post, who were doing a lot of this original reporting, bringing all of their work and other newspapers' work together to chart a path that connects all of the different bits and pieces that were floating around and saying, okay, this is who this is what was happening, this is how this connects to this. So again, if you are interested in trying to, like, you just didn't follow all those pieces, if you're curious, like, who, where, what, how, what happened, who was on what side, the impeachment managers, the Republicans on the other side, the people in Trump's White House, like, how that was all functioning as a unit, this might interest you because it puts the whole story together. But again, if you're looking for new information, that is not what this is. It is just a cohesive whole out of something that at the time seemed to be just really fragmented moving forward. Speaking of fragmented, I also then listened to the Clinton tapes, Wrestling History with the President by Taylor Branch. This has to be one of the most fascinating books that I have read for this challenge, but I read it in the wrong order. And here's what I mean. It's been actually quite difficult to get a decent biography of Bill Clinton. I don't want his autobiography or any of the other books that he's written. I'm looking for a biography on Bill Clinton's entire life and presidency, and they really don't comprehensively exist. That's fine. He's still alive. You often find that the comprehensive biographies don't come out until after they have, in Jimmy Carter's case, slowed down so much people feel a little bit confident in putting that together, or just until enough historical period has passed so we get a better sense of the larger implications of their presidency. So, Bill Clinton is a rather recent president in the scheme of things. So I thought when I heard about this book that it could be my substitute for a full biography, and it cannot. However, if you are familiar with the ins and outs of the Clinton presidency, like in the nitty-gritty details and not just the overarching scandals, this is such an interesting book, and it has so many interesting things to say about how we record history. So the idea behind it is that Taylor Branch, who is the author, he's a longtime friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton. And going forward into Clinton's term, he was very focused, Clinton, on the historical record and how to do that in a safe way, in a decent way. Because, Richard Nixon is hardly the first president to use tapes to record conversations and such. But obviously after Watergate, that is no longer a good idea at all. And so Clinton and Branch come up with this idea that intermittently Branch will come to the White House and he will ask Clinton questions about the big things that have happened and get his, like, as close to the moment as possible recollections about what is happening. Now, Branch does a lot of discussing on how, he is as involved in this process as the president is, because Branch brings the questions. Branch, has to try to steer him towards conversation. So if something happens that Branch didn't find significant, but we found significant retroactively, like the Monica Lewinsky scandal, he doesn't ask that much. He also doesn't ask a lot about the Monica Lewinsky thing because he was Clinton's friend and Hillary's friend. But, there might have been other moments in the presidency that he didn't seem were as important, or, the president is very busy, so there were longer gaps between their interviews. And then this book is fascinating because this was not written with the help of those tapes or those interviews. They were written off of Branch's recollections and notes on the interviews that he wrote and dictated on the way home and when he got home after every interview, because at the time when this book was released, Clinton had not yet made those interview tapes public. And actually, I don't know if he has yet. They're at his library and or in his possession. So there's a lot of talk not only about, like, the events of the Clinton presidency, but also Branch being a participant in this and saying, I realized later that I wish I had pressed him on this point, aka the Monica Lewinsky scandal, or other things. Or just sometimes when Clinton just really didn't want to participate and he was tired or he was sick or there was something where he just didn't want to talk about it. And it's just really, really fascinating. And Branch was also his friend. So sometimes Clinton would kind of ask for advice and Branch was like, you know, what is my role here? So the thing about it is, though, that it is so fragmented and kind of jumps, it is chronological, but it kind of like hopscotches through the presidency. And there are some things that aren't talked about at all because they either didn't have an interview or Clinton didn't want to talk about it. And you're like, what? I just didn't have a firm enough grasp of the timeline of the Clinton presidency and its ins and outs to, I think, take the full import away from this book. So that's why I wish I had read a Clinton biography and then read this. But again, it's just such an interesting book in the way that we think about history that, you know, it is rather long, but if you're interested in something that's definitely a little bit different, go for it. Just don't expect it to be a decent, you know, with context biography. That's not what this is, and that's not its point. So skipping forward to a newer release and yet bringing us all the way back to the start of our country, I listened to Travels with George: In Search of George Washington and His Legacy by Nathaniel Philbrick. I have read quite a few Nathaniel Philbrick books, and in particular, I found that his books on the American Revolution were just phenomenal, and I reviewed them in a earlier George Washington American Revolution focused supplemental. This one is weird. So here's the thing. It's not a traditional history. It is Nathaniel Philbrick and his wife and their dog deciding to literally follow in George Washington's footsteps in the several cross-country trips he made around what was then the entire United States. And so they literally, like as much as possible, follow his route and stop where he stopped and go to these small towns and see what legends do they have about George Washington, what do they remember from his visit, how do they think that impacted him. And so I thought that it would be more history focused. It definitely is more of a travelogue, I think, very much focusing on what Nathaniel and his wife and their dog are doing, including almost dying in a water spout when they were sailing. That's a good frightening time right there. So it goes back and forth between those two things, but then there's this thing that happens where, you know, I think there was a purpose to the story, to what Nathaniel thought he was trying to do. And then after they come back from all these road trips, because they didn't do them in one or two goes, they couldn't. COVID happens, the George Floyd stuff happens, and the statue stuff begins to happen. And so, you know, just with COVID alone, they've just gone on these giant road trips and now they're stuck at home. And in the beginning and the ending of it, it just doesn't seem to know exactly what message it wants to present. It's trying to make connections to larger things that I'm not sure it gets all the way there on. Like by the time it ends, it's trying to be too many things. And I mean, I totally get it, you know, seeing all of that road tripping through the lens of the things that come after, it's going to color what you write, but it just ends up not getting all the way there on any of its points. I did love, however, that one of Philbrick's big things was, you know, everywhere he went, he connected with the local librarian, the local historical society, and talked about by name the local history librarians that he met. And as someone who does quite a bit with local history at my library, I loved the fact that it read like a love letter to libraries. So good on Philbrick for thanking everyone like in the narrative for their help, but definitely not his best work. So the last book on my list is Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. This may seem like an odd book to put in what is ostensibly an American President's Reading Challenge, but I think if you haven't guessed already, it's really just time to reframe this as an American politics reading challenge. So the abbreviation does not have to change, but you cannot understand the men who were president without understanding their times. And you get a much richer idea of the evolution of American government and politics and society. But you can only do that if you bring the view back a little bit. So books like Caste, for example, are something where, it doesn't, I don't want to say on the surface it doesn't have like a political connotation, because this book is very much Isabel Wilkerson reframing the idea of race and using the word caste instead. And it is so political, even if she never used any political phrasing, which she does. But all of this is wrapped up in, who we elect, how we vote, who we are as people, and the history of American culture. So Caste is not an easy read. I really do wish that I had not been listening to it. There is a weird structure thing where there's some more narrative style in the beginning, and then there are chapters or sub-chapters on the 8 tenets of a caste system, and then it goes back into more of a narrative, and that was really confusing to follow without being able to see any formatting. I definitely wasn't prepared for it, but I think what this book does give you, if you read it or listen to it, is a different way to think about how we talk about race and class and economic status in America by using some different vocabulary to shake up the conversation and just reformat our brain a little bit, and how we're trying to wrap our head around this intersectional problem in America. And she talks really interestingly about the evolution of race, like the technical meaning of race in American culture and how that has evolved for political purposes. It's really interesting. And I know some people at work who have read it, and we've just been able to have some really, really good discussions of I've never thought about this like this, but what if we looked at it this way? How then does that change the conversation? So it's been a really interesting academic experience. It's, again, a really visceral read about, race relations in America. It's not great. There is also discussions of Nazi Germany and India in there as well, and their caste systems and how those have played out over time, and the differences and similarities that we can see there. And again, Nazis did really awful things to the Jewish population, so it's a little bit graphic at times. It's definitely very, very visceral. You can't listen to it for long periods of time if you really want to soak it in, but I'm very glad that I listened to it, and I think other people should, although you may want to read it. All right, so those are my 5 books for this episode. If you have read any of them, leave me a note down in the comments. If you have suggestions based on what I did or didn't enjoy, also leave those down in the comments. The Clinton tapes was a suggestion from Josh, so thanks Josh for that. I am paying attention and trying to just get my hands on everything. That's the goal, really. So thanks so much for everything, guys. I'll be back next time. Bye.